The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electric prayer as Katie Rodriguez pushed through the staff entrance at Oak Creek Memorial, the pre-dawn darkness still clinging to the parking lot behind her. She kept her head down, eyes fixed on the linoleum that had seen 12,000 shifts walk across it, her own footsteps just one more quiet rhythm in a hospital that never truly slept. The badge clipped to her scrubs read Kate Rodriguez, RN in clinical Arial font, all the world was allowed to know. The locker room was empty at 05 for 5, just the way she timed it. No small talk. No questions about the weekend. No eyes on her hands as she changed from street clothes into the starched uniform that made her feel like she was wearing someone else's skin. She pulled on her scrubs slowly, methodically, the way she'd learned to move in places where rushing meant dying. The long sleeves were deliberate. She always wore long sleeves, even in summer when the ICU thermostat climbed to 78 degrees and other nurses rolled their cuffs to their elbows. Katie's sleeves covered her wrists, her knuckles, the surgical scars that crisscrossed the backs of her hands like a map of a country that no longer existed. She caught her reflection in the locker mirror, brown eyes that had learned to stay neutral, a face that had perfected the art of taking up no space in a room. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez had commanded 14 personnel across 3 continents. This version, the one staring back from the mirror, was learning to disappear into the background of a Raleigh hospital like morning fog burning off asphalt. The old jacket hung in the back of her locker, khaki canvas worn soft from 6 years ago, from a life that had existed in another time zone, another language, another Katie. She rarely opened the locker now, but her hand reached for it anyway, muscle memory stronger than caution. The jacket lining held it, the faded unit patch, olive drab and threadbare at the edges, the insignia of 3rd Platoon, Bravo Company, a medical unit that had moved through Tikrit like ghosts carrying lifelines. She let her fingertips brush the embroidered letters, just for a second, just enough to ground herself in who she actually was before the day started asking her to be someone smaller. The ICU was already stirring when she clocked in at 0600. The night shift was handing off to day shift, the nurses moving between rooms with the efficient choreography of people who'd done this 10,000 times. Room 4 had a post-op abdominal resection still sedated and stable. Room 7 had a 93-year-old with CHF who'd been edematous for 3 days straight. Room 1 was empty, waiting. Room 2 held a patient 3 hours post-MI, the cardiac monitor displaying a normal sinus rhythm that looked like a blessing written in green light. Katie moved to her station, pulled up her patient assignments, and felt the familiar weight settle across her shoulders like a lead apron. For patients. Stable for now. That was all that mattered, the now. The next 4 hours. The next 12. Never looking past the shift you were inside. Rodriguez. It wasn't a greeting. It was a summons delivered from the hallway entrance like a command that expected compliance. Dr. Marcus Hargrove swept into the ICU the way he swept into everything, as if the space itself had rearranged to accommodate his presence, as if the air pressure had shifted in his favor. He wore a $3,000 suit under his white coat, the kind of suit that whispered old money and country clubs and the absolute certainty that the world had been constructed for people exactly like him. His tie was silk. His shoes were Italian leather. His eyes were the color of winter water, clear, cold, and completely without mercy. Katie felt her body respond before her mind caught up. Shoulders tightening. Breath shallowing. The autonomic nervous system responding to a predator the way prey animals always do. She kept her hands on the desk, visible and still, the way she'd learned to keep them so nothing would be misinterpreted. The long sleeve suddenly felt like armor and like a prison simultaneously. Hargrove didn't look at her directly. That was the cruelest part. He simply spoke to the residents flanking him like remoras following a shark, his voice pitched just loud enough for everyone in the unit to hear. The day shift really does seem to struggle with the basics, doesn't it? Must be the hiring standards. Or lack thereof. The residents laughed, quick, sharp little sounds like barks. One of them, a 4th-year resident named Chen with the slack face of a man who was already mentally gone from this rotation, glanced at Katie and then away. The shame wasn't even his. It belonged to her somehow, in the logic of hierarchies that had been designed before she was born. Katie didn't flinch. The trembling was internal, contained, held so far down inside her body that it looked like stillness. She'd learned this in places where a visible reaction to a threat could get people killed. The body goes quiet. The mind goes sharp. The hands stay steady. That was survival. That was always survival. She focused on her monitor, on the green line of normal sinus rhythm, on the steady flow of data that made sense in a way human interaction never would. Pain was information. Fear was information. She'd learned that in Tikrit, where learning it meant you live to see tomorrow. The flashback arrived unbidden, the way they always did, not violent but vivid, a muscle memory triggered by the sound of Hargrove's leather shoes against the tile floor. 6 years ago. Different desert. Different Katie, though the name on the uniform was the same. She was moving through the Jolan district of Fallujah, not Raleigh, through streets where the air tasted like copper and diesel exhaust and death. Her medical unit had been ordered to secure a wounded officer, Captain James Holloway, Naval Intelligence Liaison, shot through the left shoulder, bleeding arterial, conscious but fading. The route out was hot, enemy fire coming from 3 positions, and the 12-person rapid extraction team had been reduced to 8 when an IED took out the transport. Katie had grabbed the captain under the arms. His blood was warm and sticky against her hands, soaking through her uniform, and he was saying her name, not her rank, just her first name, the way men do when they're talking to someone who's about to be the last person they see. Katie. Katie, I can't, she'd cut him off, not unkindly. Stay with me, sir. Do not check out on me. Her voice had come out steady as a laser beam. Her hands had found the artery, compressed it with exactly the right pressure, and she'd moved through fire the way moving through fire becomes simple when the person you're carrying is still breathing. The extraction point was 600 meters. She'd covered it in 2 minutes 37 seconds, carrying 220 pounds of wounded officer while small arms fire cracked past like angry insects. When the Black Hawk's ramp lowered and the crew chief pulled the captain inside, Hargrove had looked her in the eye, really looked, and the recognition there was the kind that made her understand she'd just become part of something permanent in his memory. He'd grabbed her hand. His fingers had been cold despite the blood. He'd said, "Your name." She'd told him. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez. He'd held her eyes for 2 seconds longer than was tactical. Then the ramp was closing and the Black Hawk was rising and she was back on the ground with her unit, the adrenaline draining out of her like sand through a sieve, and nobody mentioned what had just happened because in that line of work, you didn't speak the things that made you human. You just moved to the next operation, the next patient, the next moment where someone's life balanced on the edge of your hands. Earth to Rodriguez. That was Marcus, a nurse who'd worked the ICU for 8 years and had the kind of competence that came from actually caring about the work. She was standing beside Katie's desk with a patient chart and an expression of barely concealed frustration. "Did you finish the labs on room 2? Katie pulled herself back into her body, back into the fluorescent light and the hospital smells, antiseptic and coffee and the faint chemical ghost of hand sanitizer. Pulled at 0540. Results should be back in 5. Good. Hargrove's going to round in 10 and he's already in a mood." Marcus lowered her voice. "Worse than usual, anyway." Katie nodded. She knew the tells. The way his jaw clenched. The particular tone he used when he was hunting for something to critique. Men like Hargrove needed enemies the way other people needed oxygen. Katie had learned long ago not to take it personally, which was its own kind of tragedy, the way you could train yourself to absorb cruelty without letting it scar you, as if damage that didn't show didn't count. "How many has he gone through now?" Katie asked quietly. She already knew the answer. 8 months at Oak Creek Memorial, and she'd been through enough shift reports and whispered conversations to piece together the history. "Nurses?" Marcus's laugh was bitter. 12 in 2 years. Fired 3. Made for quit without even formal complaints. The rest transferred out or just stopped coming. He cycles through them like he's testing a new unit. She paused, studying Katie. "Don't let it get to you. "You're doing fine." Katie didn't respond. Fine was a word for people who didn't know the difference between competence and invisibility. She was good at being invisible. She'd made an entire life out of it, the scrubs instead of the uniform, the unremarkable resume that listed only community college certification and volunteer work at a free clinic, the careful documentation of nothing that mattered. 12 doctors had abandoned this unit, moved on, transferred out, chosen other hospitals because Hargrove made the work toxic. Katie had simply decided to stay, to absorb the pressure like ballast, to move through the space he dominated the way water moves around stone, not fighting it, not fleeing it, just finding the path that existed in the current he created. Her break came at 1,000, and she spent it in the staff lounge with the door closed, sitting in the plastic chair that faced the window overlooking the parking lot. The morning was bright and empty. Her hands rested on the table, and she let herself look at the scars, the thin white lines across her knuckles, the deeper trauma marks where shrapnel from an IED had embedded itself in her skin 3 years ago, the long surgical scar across her palm from the burn surgeon's reconstruction. Hands that had held lives together. Hands that had stopped arterial bleeding with nothing but pressure and intention. Hands that had learned to be still and quiet and dangerous, like weapons that had agreed never to be used. She pulled her sleeves down, covered them again, and went back to work. The room went dead silent when Hargrove entered for morning rounds. Not the kind of silence that meant peace. The kind that meant predator, meant danger, meant everyone holding their breath and hoping they wouldn't be chosen. Katie stepped back against the cold steel supply cart, made herself smaller, kept her hands visible and her eyes on the monitor. She'd learned this choreography in 1,000 small interactions, the geometry of submission, the physics of making yourself unnoticeable. Hargrove moved from room to room, his residents trailing behind like remoras following a shark. His voice was crisp and clinical, and underneath it there was something else, something that sounded like hunger. He was looking for something to break today. Katie had learned to recognize it. The particular cadence of a man who needed to feel powerful, who needed someone to diminish so that he could feel large. She kept her head down and the unit patch stayed hidden in her locker, and somewhere in Tikrit, in a place that no longer felt real, a Navy captain who'd had her name tattooed on his forearm 6 years ago was still breathing because of her hands. That was the thing nobody understood. The real kind of power didn't announce itself. It didn't need to. Morning rounds in room for 12 started the way they always did, with Dr. Marcus Hargrove stepping through the door like a man who owned the floor beneath his shoes. Katie had Captain Holloway's chart ready, vitals current, medications verified to the 10th of a milligram. She stood at the foot of the bed, hands clasped, eyes down. The patient's wife Margaret sat in the visitor's chair. Their daughter Amy stood by the window, watching the Raleigh morning grey itself into the day. Hargrove picked up the chart with theatrical slowness, the kind of deliberate motion that announced judgment before he opened his mouth. He scanned the EKG printout Katie had mounted on page 2, his jaw moving as though he were chewing on something that tasted bad. The 2 residents trailing behind him exchanged the furtive glance of men who knew what was coming. "Nurse Rodriguez," he said, his voice pitched for the entire room to hear. "Did you actually review this EKG, or did you just tape it to the chart and hope for the best?" Margaret shifted in her chair. Amy's hand tightened on the window frame. Katie took one measured breath through her nose. Her voice, when it came, was steady as a cardiac monitor in sinus rhythm. "I noted the ST elevation in leads 2, 3, and AVF, doctor. It's documented on page 2. Right-sided leads showed reciprocal changes. Pattern consistent with inferior wall MI." Hargrove's smile didn't reach his eyes, it stopped somewhere north of his molars and never made the climb to anything genuine. "Fascinating. And where exactly did you complete your cardiology fellowship, Florence?" He didn't wait for an answer. "Because that's something we tend to discuss at medical school. EKG interpretation. Novel concept, I know." The 2 residents laughed. Not hard laughter. The careful kind that recognized authority and obedience as the same thing. Katie felt the tear before she saw it. Just one, tracking down her left cheek like a thermometer of everything she was not allowed to feel in this moment. She wiped it with her index finger, her hand moving with the efficiency of someone removing a piece of lint. Her eye stayed on Hargrove's face. Not defiant. Not submissive. Just present. A mirror held up to see what happened when you look directly at cruelty without flinching. "I understand your concerns, Doctor," she said. The words landed in the room like a stone in still water. Margaret looked at her daughter. Amy looked away from the window. And Hargrove's smile flattened into something that resembled satisfaction, which was worse than anger. Anger had edges you could understand, but satisfaction meant he believed he had won something that mattered. By afternoon, Katie sat alone in the break room at a corner table with a turkey sandwich that tasted like cardboard and a container of yogurt that had expired 4 days ago, but she ate it anyway because she had stopped caring about small things like food poisoning. The fluorescent lights hummed their usual monotone hymn to institutional neglect. She had been sitting there for 90 seconds when it happened. All 6 of them moved at once, like a flock of birds sensing weather change. 2 nurses, 3 techs, 1 respiratory therapist. They gathered their lunches in silence, their movements coordinated by some instinct that had nothing to do with plan and everything to do with survival. No one met her eyes. No one said anything. They simply relocated to the far side of the break room, the implicit message crystallizing in the space between them. Proximity to Katie Rodriguez was a liability they could no longer afford. She watched them settle at the long table across the room. They were talking now, low voices, normal laughter. The sound came at her like evidence, like proof written in ambient noise that isolation was a choice people made when the alternative meant standing next to someone marked as unsafe. Katie finished her sandwich. The yogurt. Threw the containers away with the kind of mechanical precision that required no consciousness, no awareness, no self. Just hands and motion. She was good at that. At 1400, she found the paper posted on the unit communication board at eye level. Hargrove's handwriting was precise, each letter a small assertion of authority. Performance concern, N. Rodriguez, questioning physician judgment without clinical basis. Pattern of overstepping scope of practice. Counseling required. "Come in," he said. Not a request. A command with the courtesy of politeness, which made it worse. She stepped inside. The office smelled like expensive cologne and something underneath it, the particular staleness of air that hadn't seen the outside world since the furniture arrived. His desk was mahogany or something close to it, the kind that announced inherited money or the serious illusion of it. Framed certificates covered the wall. Board memberships. Hospital commendations. A photograph of Hargrove with what looked like hospital administrators, their arms around each other in the practiced closeness of people bound by mutual obligation. He slid a folder across the desk. It was 3 pages thick. The kind of document that arrived with the weight of finality. Performance improvement plan, he said, his voice moving through the syllables like a man reading a menu he had already memorized. Every clinical decision you make now requires physician countersignature. Nothing gets done without one of us putting our name on it. Nothing. He paused, letting that sink in the way stones sink in water, entirely. "I've already discussed your pattern of overstepping with 3 board members. They're very concerned about your scope creep. They wanted me to tell you that explicitly." Katie's hands rested motionless in her lap. She had learned in Tikrit that sometimes the strongest response was the one that announced nothing at all. No tremor. No quickened breath. No visible evidence of the machinery grinding inside. "How long is the improvement period?" she asked. "As long as I deem necessary." He smiled. "Could be 30 days. Could be 6 months. Depends on how cooperative you become." He leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight with the sound of worn leather giving up the fight. "I think you're beginning to understand that this hospital has standards, Rodriguez. Standards that don't include nurses who think they know better than physicians. Standards that don't include people who question my judgment." He gestured at the folder. "Read it. Sign it. And maybe, we can move past this unfortunate pattern you've developed." Katie picked up the folder. The paper was heavy, expensive stock. The kind of document designed to feel official, permanent, irrevocable. She held it for a moment without opening it, just letting the weight sit in her hands like a question. "I understand," she said. She stood, turned, and walked out of his office without meeting his eyes, without asking questions, without giving him anything else to feed on. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like something breaking. But not the kind of breaking that made noise. The kind that happened inside where no one could hear it. That night, she drove home with her hands locked on the steering wheel at 10 and 2 o'clock, the way they had taught her in a driver's education class in a high school that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. She parked in her driveway and sat in the car for 20 minutes with the engine off, watching her breath fog against the windshield. Her phone sat in her lap, dark. No messages. No missed calls. Just silence and the particular weight of knowing that isolation doesn't announce itself. It moves in quietly, like someone taking a seat beside you at a funeral, and you don't realize how heavy it is until you try to stand up. David was at the kitchen table when she came inside, his geometry homework spread out in front of him like evidence of his own competence, his own straight-line certainty about how the world worked. He looked up when she came through the door, and something in her face must have registered as an emergency, because his expression shifted from casual teenage indifference to something older, something that looked like concern, and she could not bear that, could not let him see her like this, could not let him understand that the person who raised him had somehow become someone that even her own colleagues refused to sit with. "Hey, Mom," he said. "Careful. The way you speak to something fragile." "Hey, baby," she replied, and her voice held, which was a kind of victory. "I'm going to shower. Homework looking good." She made it upstairs before the trembling started. Made it to the bathroom. Made it to the shower where the sound of water could cover the sound of breathing that wasn't quite under control. She stood under the spray for 30 minutes, letting it run too hot, letting it burn everything down to baseline. Her hands pressed against the tile wall, and for a moment she felt the muscle memory of something older, something from before, hands that had held tourniquets in place, hands that had moved with the terrifying precision of someone who had learned to operate in the space between life and death. Those hands felt like they belonged to a different person now. But that wasn't the worst part. The ambulance bay doors burst open at 2,200 hours, and the stretcher came through like a ship cutting through dark water. Captain James Holloway lay motionless under the fluorescent glare, his vitals projected on the monitor mounted to the gurney, blood pressure 94/58 and dropping, oxygen saturation 89%, heart rate erratic at 127 and climbing. His navy dress blues were partially unbuttoned, and his dog tags lay against the pale skin of his chest, catching the overhead light like a prayer someone had given up on. The paramedic was calling out narrative, acute coronary syndrome, chest pain started 40 minutes ago at a community event, possible MI in progress, they'd pushed aspirin and established 2 large bore lines during transport. Katie watched from her position near the admission desk, watching the way the paramedic's hands moved with practiced efficiency, the way they transferred authority seamlessly to the ER physician, and something in her chest went very still. She knew those dog tags. She knew the name engraved on them. She had known the man attached to them when his hands were trembling from blood loss and shock in the streets of Tikrit, when his eyes were asking her a question she wasn't sure he even knew he was asking, when her voice telling him, "Stay with me, sir," had been the difference between him going home or going home in a flag-draped box. 6 years. The calculation was automatic, the same way her body knew how to read a cardiac monitor before her mind caught up. 6 years since she'd been Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez commanding a 14-person extraction team in hostile territory. 6 years since she'd become just Katie, just a nurse, just the invisible woman in scrubs who kept her head down and her scars covered and her military history locked in a footlocker at the bottom of her closet. Captain Holloway was brought to ICU 7, the same unit where Katie worked the night shift, the same unit where Dr. Marcus Hargrove ruled like a general commanding a war no one else understood they were fighting. The assignment came through at 22:07. Katie was assigned as his primary nurse. She felt the weight of it settle on her the way sandbags settled into the bottom of a Black Hawk before takeoff, something you felt in your bones before your mind could process the mathematics of what it meant. She requested the assignment be given to someone else. The charge nurse looked at her with mild confusion. Why? You're the best we have. Katie had no answer that wouldn't require her to explain 6 years of hiding, so she accepted the assignment and walked into ICU 7 with her hand steady and her face carefully neutral. Captain Holloway was conscious, which made everything harder. His eyes were the color she remembered, dark brown, intelligent, the kind of eyes that didn't miss much even when pain was rewriting his nervous system. She hung his labs on the chart and reviewed the initial workup, troponin elevated at 2.4, BNP through the roof, EKG showing ST elevation in the anterior leads. His ejection fraction on the portable echo was running at 35%, dangerously low. He needed a cardiology consult. He needed interventional cath lab assessment. He needed decisions made fast. Katie documented her findings in the electronic health record and moved through the room with a kind of precision that came from training, checking for sites, adjusting flow rates, monitoring the cardiac rhythm as it played out in green lines across the monitor. She did not make eye contact. She did not speak more than necessary. She did not allow her voice to carry any of the urgency that was tightening in her chest like a fist. What she didn't know was that Dr. Hargrove had already been informed of Captain Holloway's admission. What she didn't know was that he was already moving through the hospital corridors with the kind of velocity that suggested something had shifted in the unit's gravitational field. He appeared at the nurses' station at 22:24, his presence announced by the sudden quiet that fell over the staff, the kind of quiet that comes from animals sensing a predator has entered the room. His eyes moved across the unit board, scanning patient names and assignments, and Katie felt the moment his attention landed on ICU 7. He didn't speak. He didn't acknowledge her presence. He simply walked toward the room, his movements carrying the weight of someone accustomed to having doors open before he reached them and answers appear before he asked questions. She heard him in the room with Captain Holloway. She heard the low murmur of his voice conducting the assessment, the careful warmth he reserved for patients who mattered, the tone that was entirely different from the one he used when addressing nursing staff. She heard Captain Holloway's responses, steady and measured, the voice of a military officer accustomed to medical evaluations and chain-of-command structures. Hargrove spent 17 minutes in the room. Katie tracked it the way she tracked everything now, the way soldiers track time in hostile zones. 17 minutes was longer than his typical patient assessment, longer than the cursory reviews he conducted with most admissions, longer than his pattern. When he emerged, he did not return to the nurses' station. He went directly to his office, his pace unhurried, his demeanor unchanged, but something in the quality of his attention had shifted. At 22:49, one of the surgical residents, a woman named Chen who Katie barely knew, approached the nurses' station while Katie was documenting. Chen was carrying a clipboard and moving with a kind of careful hesitation that suggested she was about to deliver news she wasn't sure how to package. "Your patient in ICU 7, Chen said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Captain Holloway. He's connected. Really connected. His family has military ties, his uncle's a retired flag officer, Pentagon Advisory Board. His wife used to work in congressional liaison." The information hung in the air between them like a change in air pressure before a storm. Katie didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. She understood the calculus. She understood that in a hospital where Dr. Hargrove had spent 6 years building alliances with board members and securing his position through strategic relationships, a patient with genuine institutional power was a different kind of case entirely. When she glanced toward Hargrove's office, she saw him standing in the doorway, and in that single moment, the way his gaze had shifted, the way his posture had straightened fractionally, the way his hand adjusted his tie, she recognized the subtle mechanics of recalibration. He was a man who understood leverage the way other people understood breathing. He was a man who could assess the political weight of a patient the way a trader assessed market fluctuations. And now his full attention was on ICU 7, on the patient who had institutional protection, on the case that could either elevate him or destroy him depending on execution. Katie looked back at her monitor and returned to her charting. but the tightness in her chest had become something else now, something that felt like recognition, like the moment in combat when you realize the battlefield you thought you understood has just shifted beneath your feet. At 23:01, Captain Holloway's oxygen saturation began to trend downward. 94, 92. 90, his breathing was becoming more laborious despite the oxygen running at 4 liters per nasal cannula. Katie adjusted the delivery to a non-rebreather mask and watched the numbers climb slightly, back to 93, but something was wrong. She could feel it the way an animal feels earthquakes, through senses that didn't have names. She pulled his most recent chest X-ray onto the monitor and studied it against the baseline film from admission. The mediastinal silhouette looked different. Slightly wider. The trick here is she turned the image, studying the anatomy, there was a subtle deviation. Early mediastinal shift. The kind of finding that could be easy to miss on a preliminary reading, the kind of observation that required someone to be looking for it, the kind of detail that separated good nursing from the kind of nursing that went unnoticed until it was too late. She paged the on-call physician at 23:05. No response. She paged again at 23:09. Silence. She checked the roster and called the operator to verify that the number was correct, then paged a third time, adding stat to the message and watching her words appear in the system like a prayer being transmitted into the void. Captain Holloway's breathing was becoming more labored. His lips were beginning to show the first faint signs of cyanosis, a color that started as a whisper and became a scream if you didn't address it fast enough. His heart rate was climbing, 134. 138. 142. Katie moved to his bedside and placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice dropping into the register she used for crisis, the one that carried command without sounding like she was commanding anything. Captain, I need you to focus on slow deep breaths. In through your nose, out through your mouth. He nodded, his eyes still intelligent, but now they carried the beginnings of fear. The same fear she'd seen in Tikrit when the mortars started falling and men realized that chaos didn't follow procedures. The same fear she'd learned to recognize and then set aside because setting it aside was the only way to function when functioning was the only tool you had. At 23:17, Katie stood and walked toward the physician's conference room. She didn't run. She didn't call out. She moved with the kind of efficiency that came from being trained in how to operate when systems had failed and improvisation was the only protocol that mattered. The conference room door was closed, but the interior was visible through the reinforced glass window. 12 figures sat arranged around the central table, every attending physician on the night roster, every resident, every senior fellow. The fluorescent panels above them cast everything in harsh relief, and on the screen behind them, Katie could see Dr. Hargrove's presentation slide, the title in bold sans serif font, Nursing Scope Creep, a Patient Safety Crisis. The next slide was already queued up. She could see her own name. She could see her interventions listed with surgical precision, each one stripped of context, each one presented as a violation of physician authority, each one positioned as evidence of boundary violation. She knocked. The sound was crisp. Professional. Urgent without being panicked. 12 faces turned in unison, 12 sets of eyes focusing on the door and then on her. Hargrove's expression shifted, not surprise exactly, but something colder, something that reminded her of the precise moment a hunting animal realizes its prey has stopped running and started fighting back. He stood with the kind of unhurried grace that suggested he had been expecting this moment, preparing for it, understanding that this particular confrontation would define something essential about the unit's power structure. "We're in the middle of an emergency meeting," he said, his voice carrying the weight of formal authority. "This can wait." "Captain Holloway in ICU 7 is decompensating," Katie said quietly. "I need a physician assessment immediately." Her hands at her sides were perfectly still. Her breathing was perfectly controlled. The trembling that might have come was somewhere far away, locked in a compartment she knew how to seal. "His O2 saturation is declining despite maximum support. His trachea is deviating. I suspect mediastinal shift secondary to. And I need nursing staff to follow the chain of command," Hargrove interrupted, his voice dropping into the register that made residents shift in their seats. "Page the charge nurse." We'll address this when the meeting concludes. He said it without anger. That was the thing about Hargrove. He was most dangerous when he was calm, when he was using precision instead of volume, when he was wielding authority like a scalpel instead of a club. Doctor, his trachea is deviating. I think. What you think, Hargrove said, is not relevant. What's relevant is that you've called 3 unnecessary codes this month, wasting physician time and triggering protocols that disrupt patient care. Return to your station and follow proper channels. He sat back down before she finished processing his words. Around the table, 12 physicians looked at their hands, at their laptops, at the presentation slide, anywhere but at her. None of them moved. None of them spoke. The message was clear, transmitted wordlessly through the silent room like a neural impulse traveling down a spinal column. Responding to her would cost them. Hargrove had made that cost explicit, and 12 professional people had calculated it and decided it was too high. Katie returned to ICU 7 alone. The door closed behind her with a soft hiss of air pressure equalizing. Captain Holloway's lips were definitely cyanotic now, a faint blue-gray spreading from the edges inward like ink bleeding through paper. His wife Margaret sat in the chair beside his bed, her hand gripping his, her face carrying the expression of someone watching disaster unfold in slow motion and unable to stop it. "Where's the doctor?" she asked, her voice small and rising. "I need you to step outside," Katie said. She didn't wait for agreement. She didn't ask permission. She simply waited until Margaret had gathered her purse and moved toward the door, then locked it behind her. Her hands were moving before her mind finished catching up, steady, precise, informed by 6 years of emergency medicine training in the worst possible classroom. She positioned Captain Holloway supine, palpated his chest wall with 2 fingers, found the landmark she needed, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The needle decompression kit was in the crash cart, right where it was supposed to be. She opened it and felt muscle memory take over, the kind of memory that lived in her hands, not her brain, the kind that belonged to the woman she'd been before she became the woman she was pretending to be. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping was a sound like redemption. The chest X-ray glows on the monitor at 2,145 hours. Katie leans in, her eyes tracking the subtle shift in the mediastinal line that the radiologist's preliminary report completely missed. The trachea deviates slightly left. The right lung compresses. Early signs. Unmistakable to anyone who's watched a soldier's chest collapse under pressure in a combat medical bay. Tension pneumothorax. Not yet critical. But coming. She reaches for the phone. The code operator answers on the first ring. Code team standing by. Captain Holloway, bed 4. Tension pneumothorax developing. Need full code response. Sending now. Katie hangs up and moves to the bedside. Captain Holloway's oxygen saturation reads 88%. His breathing shallow. His color graying at the edges. She pulls the curtain and checks his lung sounds, diminished on the right side, exactly as the X-ray predicted. "Sir, you're going to feel some pressure in your chest. The team's coming." 90 seconds pass. Then 2 minutes. The overhead speaker crackles. An unfamiliar voice. "Code team, stand down." Repeat, "Stand down." Return to conference room immediately. Katie's hands go still. She moves to the corridor. Through the glass walls of the main conference room, she sees them, all 12 physicians. All of them. The entire night roster of attendings and residents, sitting in rows like a congregation, and Dr. Hargrove standing at the lectern with a presentation slide projected behind him. The title reads, Nursing Scope Creep, Operational Impact and Liability. He sees her in the doorway and smiles. Not a smile. A knife edge. "Gentlemen," Hargrove says, his voice carrying the precision of someone who has orchestrated this with military planning, any response to unauthorized clinical interventions would be seen as insubordination. "We've worked too hard building this unit's standards to let that crumble now." The doctors don't move. Not one. Katie counts them silently. 12 faces. 12 degrees of compliance. 12 physicians who will stay in this room and let a man die rather than cross Marcus Hargrove. She turns and walks back to bed 4. Captain Holloway's oxygen saturation has dropped to 82%. His breathing labors. The monitor shows his heart rate climbing, 118, 121, 125. Compensating. Failing. The trachea shift visible now even without the X-ray, a shadow beneath his skin that wasn't there 10 minutes ago. The pressure inside his chest is rising with every breath he takes. In another minute, his heart will have nowhere to beat. In 2 minutes, he'll arrest. Katie's hands move on their own. Muscle memory. Not hospital protocol. Combat protocol. She opens the emergency airway cart and reaches for the 14-gauge angiocath needle. The metal is cool against her palm. She swabs the skin at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact location where compressed air sits trapped between the lung and chest wall, slowly suffocating everything around it. "I need you to stay still, sir," she says quietly. "What are you?" Captain Holloway gasps. The needle enters. Katie's angle is perfect because her hands have done this before in a convoy outside Tikrit with incoming fire and a Marine bleeding out and no time for hesitation. The pressure is different here. The stakes are different. But the technique is identical. The catheter slides over the needle, advances into the pleural space, and then the hiss of air escaping. Pressurized air, rushing out like a held breath finally released, like oxygen itself rejoicing. Like redemption. Captain Holloway gasps and suddenly can breathe. His oxygen saturation climbs immediately. 75%. 82%. 88%. 93%. His heart rate begins to drop. 122, 118. 112, his color returns like someone painting his skin back into the living world. His eyes flutter open, confused and gasping but alive, and Katie secures the catheter with tape and steps back. The monitor shows sinus rhythm. Strong. Steady. Alive. 90 seconds. That's all it took. Katie documents everything with precision. Procedure. Indication. Time. Response. Her hand shakes slightly as she writes, but her handwriting remains steady, the handwriting of someone trained to document under artillery fire. When she finishes, she walks to the conference room door. The meeting has just concluded. The 12 doctors file out in silence, their eyes avoiding hers, their shoulders carrying the weight of compliance. Dr. Hargrove stands in the corridor with 2 security officers flanking him like apostles, and Sharon Chen, the chief nursing officer, stands beside them with her face arranged into an expression of profound regret. Sharon speaks first. Her voice is gentle but carries the weight of a hammer. "Katie, your badge, please." Katie removes it without argument. The badge swings from its lanyard like a pendulum marking time. Dr. Hargrove has contacted the State Medical Board, Sharon continues. "You've been reported for practicing medicine without a license." The security officers step closer, not threatening, just present. Just making it official. Katie meets Hargrove's eyes. His expression is a study in controlled satisfaction, a man who has just eliminated a problem with surgical precision. She speaks once, her voice flat and steady. Captain Holloway had a tension pneumothorax. He would have arrested in under 2 minutes. You made sure the code team wouldn't respond. Hargrove's smile widens. That determination, Nurse Rodriguez, is not yours to make. You've just ended your career. She doesn't respond. There's nothing to respond to. She hands the badge to Sharon and walks toward the exit, her spine straight, her movements controlled, the way someone walks when they've learned that dignity is the only power they have left. By 0200 hours, the network reveals itself. A call from the State Nursing Board, investigation opened. Katie listens to the recorded message twice, as if repetition might change the words. A second call, the community health clinic where she'd volunteered for 3 years has suspended her privileges pending the investigation. A third, her apartment manager, distant and formal, informing her that Dr. Hargrove has expressed concerns about her stability and the lease renewal might need to be reassessed. And then the worst one. The call from David's school counselor at 07:45 the next morning, gentle voice suggesting that her son might benefit from counseling during this difficult period in his mother's professional life. Hargrove has found him. Found his boy and planted seeds of concern like poison in rich soil. All within 6 hours. All coordinated. All executed with the precision of someone who has spent years building a network of favors and threats and quiet agreements. Hargrove doesn't just have power. He has leverage. He has reach. He has proven that he can touch anything she cares about and make it bleed. At 1,400 hours, Katie clears her locker. The unit patch comes out last, faded olive drab, the edges worn from decades of being stitched and restitched, the symbol of every transformation she's ever survived. She holds it for a moment, then returns it to her jacket lining where it's hidden again, where it belongs. She places her nameplate in a box. Her coffee mug. The half-empty bottle of lotion she kept in the desk drawer. The small items that made the space hers. She drives home in complete silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel, the box on the passenger seat like a coffin. Her kitchen table is where she finally breaks. The sobs come from somewhere deeper than her chest, from the place where she buried the nightmares, the place she thought was soundproof. They're not. They're never soundproof. She collapses into a chair and surrenders to it, every loss, every failure, every reason she ran from the uniform in the first place. Tikrit. The medevacs. The decision she made that saved some lives and couldn't save others. The identity she constructed so carefully to escape those ghosts, built from quiet competence and invisibility and the belief that if she stayed small enough, the past would forget her. But the past never forgets. It just waits. She's still crying when David comes home at 15:30, his backpack hitting the floor with the thoughtless force of a 14-year-old who has no idea what he's walking into. Mom? Why are you home? Katie can't look at him. Can't find words that make sense. Can't explain why the armor she built for both of them has just shattered. Mama just needs a minute, baby, she whispers. David has never seen her cry. Not once in 14 years. Not when his father left. Not when the bills were impossible. Not when the nightmares woke her at 3 in the morning and she had to pretend she was fine. He backs away slowly, terrified by something he doesn't understand, and goes to his room. Katie puts her head on the table and surrenders completely, to the failure, to the fear, to the knowledge that Marcus Hargrove has broken the only thing that mattered, her ability to protect her child. The silence lasts exactly 3 minutes. Then her phone rings. An unknown number. Then another. Then a third. By evening, she stops counting. By morning, there's a commotion in the neighborhood, a car she doesn't recognize parked at the curb, 2 people in dark jackets getting out, and one of them carrying a folder that looks like it weighs 1,000 pounds. She answers the door before they knock. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez. Her real name. Spoken aloud in front of her house. In front of the neighbors. In front of David, watching from the hallway with his eyes wider than she's ever seen them. Yes, she says. Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need to talk about Dr. Marcus Hargrove. The State Nursing Board investigators arrived at Oak Creek Memorial by 8 a.m., their credentials clipped to their lanyards like weapons, their questions sharper than any blade. They had files thick as medical charts. They had timelines. They had Dr. Marcus Hargrove's formal complaint, now a federal matter, now something that required badge numbers and legal notarization. Katie sat in the administrative conference room while they asked about her credentials, her training history, the gap in her licensure records from 2016 to 2018, a gap she had filled with classified deployments and combat medicine in a place she could not name. She answered each question with the precision of someone who had already rehearsed her lies. She did not tremble. She did not flinch. She simply told them what she had prepared to tell them, knowing none of it would matter. But that wasn't the worst part. While Katie answered their questions, Dr. Hargrove had been working his network like a man operating on deadline. He called the community health clinic in southeast Raleigh where Katie volunteered every third Saturday, told them there was an ongoing investigation into her credentials, suggested they might want to be cautious about liability exposure. The clinic director called by noon and cancelled her volunteer status, his voice apologetic but final. At 1:24 p.m., Hargrove contacted Katie's apartment complex manager at Riverside Gardens, mentioning in passing that a former employee with questionable judgment was currently under investigation for scope creep violations. The manager began the eviction process at 2 p.m., 30 days' notice, perfectly legal, perfectly executed. Then came the call to David's school, St. Catherine Academy, where he was a scholarship student. Hargrove introduced himself as a hospital quality officer, mentioned that Katie's professional reliability had become a concern, and asked if the school felt comfortable maintaining the tuition waiver for the son of an employee under federal investigation. By the time Katie's shift ended at 2 p.m., her badge had been deactivated. Chief Nursing Officer Sharon Chen stood beside security with a manila envelope containing Katie's termination paperwork. "I'm so sorry," Sharon said, and Katie could see she actually meant it. "His board connections, the investigation, we can't protect you right now." Katie's hands felt like they belonged to someone else as she removed her badge and set it on the desk. The metallic clatter echoed through the hallway like a judge's gavel. One of the nurses she had worked with for 2 years, Amy, who had eaten lunch beside her at least 300 times, turned away rather than meet her eyes. Katie drove home in silence. The kind of silence that stretches across time like an infection. Silence that tastes like copper and failure. She gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, her knuckles white, her breathing controlled, the same breathing technique she had used in Fallujah when rounds came through the compound walls. She had rebuilt a life. She had remade herself. She had chosen invisibility as armor, and it had shattered the moment someone decided to look close enough. By 3 p.m. she was home. By 4 p.m. she was alone at the kitchen table, her dress uniform hanging in the closet behind winter coats she never wore, the medals locked in a velvet case she had not opened since 2018. Katie pressed her palms flat against the table and let herself fall apart. Not loud. Not theatrical. Just tears that came like a storm finally breaking, shoulders that shook once, twice, then stopped. She had learned not to scream. She had learned how to cry without sound, how to grieve without witnesses. That was who she had become, someone who fell apart in private, someone who held herself together for everyone else. Someone no one would ever save because no one knew she needed saving. An hour later, David found her there. Her 14-year-old son, tall enough now that he had to duck slightly under the kitchen doorway, holding his backpack and his keys and a face that had learned too early not to ask questions he didn't want answered. He set his bag down carefully. "Mom." His voice was 17 parts uncertain, 3 parts something harder, something that came from watching his mother pretend to be less than she was for 6 years. Katie looked up and could not speak. Could not explain. Could only whisper, "Mama just needs a minute, baby." David sat down across from her. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't ask questions. He just sat there, across the kitchen table in the house they could no longer afford to stay in, and let her fall apart one more time. When she finally steadied her breathing, he was still there. When she finally met his eyes, she saw something she had not expected to see, recognition. Not pity. Recognition. "You're going to tell me what happened," he said. Not a question. Katie opened her mouth. Then closed it. Then began to tell him everything. By 8 a.m. the next morning, David walked into the hospital administration office. The dress uniform was draped carefully over his arm, navy blue with gold buttons, the fabric starched to a precise edge, a garment that had not seen daylight in 6 years. The velvet case of medals was clutched in his shaking hands because David was 14 and he was terrified and he was braver than anyone in that conference room would ever be. Sharon Chen was there. The state nursing board investigators were there. A lawyer from the hospital was there. And Dr. Hargrove stood in the corner, his face already pale because he knew. He had seen David. He had seen the uniform. He already understood that he had made a catastrophic mistake. "My mom is Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez," David said. His voice did not shake. "And you need to see these." He opened the velvet case. A staff nurse named Michelle, someone who had nodded to Katie 1,000 times without really seeing her, reached for the file David had brought. Her hands trembled as she read aloud. Each citation was printed on official Navy letterhead, stamped and sealed and impossible to dismiss. Navy and Marine Corps Medal. She paused. Swallowed. Awarded for exceptional heroism and extraordinary skill during combat operations in Tikrit, Iraq, 2017. Sharon Chen's face went white. The investigators leaned forward. Michelle's voice dropped an octave as she read the next one. Bronze Star with Valor. For exceptional service and courage under enemy fire. And then, Purple Heart. Twice. Michelle's eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. Awarded for wounds received in combat. Captain James Holloway rolled into the conference room in his wheelchair, his cardiac scar still fresh beneath his hospital gown, his eyes locked on David and then, slowly, the way memory works when something has been buried for 6 years, on the uniform. His voice, when he spoke, had the quality of someone surfacing from deep water. "I know that voice," he said. His words were soft but they filled the room like a physical force. "I know that voice because it told me to stay with me, sir, when I was dying in the streets of Tikrit. I know that voice because it never wavered. Not once." He took the medals from David's hands and read each one himself, his fingers tracing the engraved names and dates. Navy and Marine Corps Medal. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. He looked up at Dr. Hargrove, and his eyes were the color of flint. "Those aren't decorations for scope creep violations, Doctor. Those are the medals of a warrior." The room went so quiet you could hear the heart monitor in the hallway beeping its steady rhythm. Then the door opened again, and a man in his 60s walked in wearing a Navy Reserve uniform with the insignia of a retired commander. He had been called by the hospital board. He had seen the file. He sat down slowly and spoke with the precision of someone who had spent 40 years in the military. "I know this mission," he said, running his finger across Katie's official discharge papers. "I know the extraction she commanded. 12 wounded sailors. Enemy forces from 3 directions. She led a team through fire and got every single one of them out alive. Every single one." He met Dr. Hargrove's eyes. "Son, that woman didn't violate scope of practice. That woman performed emergency medical intervention that saved Captain Holloway's life. And you fabricated documentation to cover the fact that you prevented 12 physicians from responding to her call." The FBI agent who had been standing in the corner, Rivera, who had been watching Dr. Hargrove's face during the entire revelation, stepped forward and opened his phone. The email was on his screen, sent from Hargrove's hospital account to himself 3 hours after Katie's termination. Need to add disciplinary file entries from 2020 to 2023 to establish pattern. Medical board less likely to question if prior issues documented. Call Morrison on board, ensure his cooperation. Timeline. The handwriting of a man in panic. The proof of a man in free fall. "Dr. Hargrove," Rivera said, his voice like a judge reading a verdict, "we're investigating you for falsifying federal employment records, obstruction of justice, and filing false statements to federal investigators. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Dr. Hargrove's face did not go red. It went white. The color of surrender. The color of everything he had built, the board connections, the fear he had cultivated, the reputation he had weaponized, collapsing in real time. His attorney reached for his arm, but he barely seemed to notice. Katie was not in the room. She did not need to be. The truth had arrived without her presence, and it was so much more powerful than any explanation she could have offered. By noon, the state medical board had suspended his license pending full investigation. By 2 p.m., federal charges had been filed. By 4 p.m., Oak Creek Memorial had terminated him and notified him that security would escort him from the premises at 8 a.m., pending criminal charges. By 6 p.m., the local news was running the story, decorated Navy hero fired after saving patient, investigation reveals hospital sabotage. The narrative flipped so completely that Katie found herself watching the evening news from her kitchen table, seeing her own name on the screen, listening to Margaret Holloway describe how her husband's life had been saved by a woman the hospital had tried to destroy. That night, Sharon Chen called. "Katie, I need to ask, would you consider coming back? We want to make this right. Full reinstatement. Back pay. We're prepared to offer." Katie asked for 24 hours to think about it. She spent those hours with David in the kitchen, where she opened the velvet case and showed him each medal, each citation, each decorated piece of metal that represented the parts of herself she had buried so deep she had almost believed they were gone. She told him about Tikrit, about the 12 sailors, about why she had chosen to become invisible instead of choosing to be seen. She told him about the nightmares that woke her at 3 a.m., and the reason she had hidden her scars under long sleeves for 6 years, and why she had never let anyone get close enough to ask questions. David listened. When she finished, he reached across the table and took her hand. "You were never invisible, Mom," he said. "You were just hiding." The next morning, Katie walked into Oak Creek Memorial wearing her Navy uniform. The dress blue was pressed so sharply you could cut glass on it. The faded unit patch, the one she had kept sewn inside her jacket lining for 6 years, the one she had never shown a single person, the one she had held like a secret prayer, was now pinned to her shoulder where it belonged. The nurses who had turned away from her in the break room could not meet her eyes. The ones who had nodded at her every day without really seeing her finally saw her. They saw the scars. They saw the medals. They saw the woman who had been standing in their hallway the entire time, saving lives while breaking her own heart to stay invisible. And when Captain Holloway, still recovering but already standing with physical therapy support, saluted her, the entire ICU watched a Navy captain honor a senior chief petty officer with a respect that made every other interaction in that hospital feel small and wrong and finally over. Within 48 hours, Dr. Hargrove had lost his license, his reputation, his position, and his freedom. Within a week, he had hired 2 lawyers and was negotiating a plea deal. Within a month, the deal was finalized: 2 years in federal prison, 5 years probation, permanent ban from medical practice. To pay his legal fees and court-ordered restitution, Dr. Marcus Hargrove took a job teaching CPR certification courses at Raleigh Community College for $15 an hour. The same pay as a parking lot attendant. The same compensation as someone with a high school diploma. The empire he had built through fear had evaporated the moment someone decided to shine a light on it, and now his only choice was to spend his days teaching people how to save lives, the very thing he had tried to prevent Katie from doing. The irony was not lost on anyone. Katie adjusted Captain Holloway's telemetry during his final post-operative check 6 months later. His heart rhythm was strong. His recovery was complete. His gratitude was endless and complicated and genuine. She caught her reflection in the window, the same hands that had held lives together in combat, the same steady competence, but no longer hidden. The faded unit patch on her shoulder was visible to everyone now. It was finally where it belonged. If you're watching this, you understand something about quiet strength, about the cost of invisibility, about the power of showing up even when everyone walks away. Subscribe to this channel. Like this video. And in the comments, tell me, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark.